Thank you for downloading analysis from the BBC. Have you ever thought about how you'd like to be looked after in your old age? In this edition, Sonia Soda looks at how we might fundamentally rethink how we care for older people.
This is the story of Britain's old people. People too old to speak for themselves, with no one to speak for them.
We're all going to get old one day. But for many people, the idea of living in a care home conjures up a fear of boredom, loneliness and neglect.
All too many live in the dread seclusion of loneliness, many infirm, many in failing health.
Revelations about abuse of older people by professional carers seem to feature in news bulletins at worryingly regular intervals.
What we do attack is a system for which the British public alone is ultimately responsible.
Every time I see a secretly recorded clip of a care home resident being neglected, I feel sick. What if that was my mother or father? But I also feel scared. Like many people in my early 30s, I worry about what will happen when my parents need care. This Pathé News film suggests these concerns aren't at all new.
If this were a scene from Charles Dickens, we would shudder at it. Yet this is in Britain, in 1947.
I'm Sonia Soda, and I'm a social policy analyst. There have been extensive political and policy debates about how best to improve the nation's schools and hospitals. But much less energy and thought seems to go into thinking about how we get better care services. I'm interested in why that is. In particular, we seem to spend remarkably little time thinking about the caring workforce, the very people who end up caring for our loved ones. There are fundamental differences between the way care is provided and our education and health services. There's no care system as such. Instead, there is a disparate landscape of private companies and charities providing care services in care homes and people's own homes. Julienne Mayer is Professor of Nursing and Care for Older People at City University.
Older people used to be cared for in hospital. As hospitals evolved and people stayed in hospital for less time, older people in hospital were seen sometimes as bed blockers because they don't recover necessarily as quickly. In the mid-1980s, there was the wholesale shift of older people out of hospital and into the community, and that's when the care home sector really set off. And care that had been delivered by nurses became redefined as social care and personal care. These are private, independent businesses, some for profit, some not for profit. It's a fragmented sector.
There are undoubtedly some great care homes and agencies out there. But there are also some that aren't delivering the warm, empathetic care that we'd all want for our parents.
Currently, we have a system where you've got the lowest paid workers providing really difficult, emotionally challenging care to strangers, effectively, or at least at the beginning, strangers. They're working in a very adversarial, accusatory system, which has them on edge and feeling very vulnerable themselves at the same time. Working in often fairly enclosed, isolated places. I don't think you could create a system that was less able to prevent casual neglect than the one we've got at the moment.
That was John Kennedy, Director of Care Services at the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust in York. He oversees their retirement villages and care homes. He believes that too often we see care as a series of physical tasks rather than as a complex emotional endeavour.
My father was in a hospice and he asked me to give him a shave. Now that was just a shave. Now I did it gladly, but it wasn't the easiest thing to do when you consider, a father and son relationship and you're now there with your father who is frailer than you've ever seen him before and needing that sort of care. How does it work if you're a stranger? How does it work if you're working in a care home or you're working in social care and you're asked to go and help Mrs. Smith to go to the toilet? Then you've got to help her maintain her dignity and clean up afterwards and possibly then put some cream on to keep her skin well and then get her back into her clothes. Should that be done in a rushed manner? Should that be done in a manner that is just like a Henry Ford production line, which is what we've got fundamentally at the moment? Should it be done in a way where actually what the carer's worried about most is if they've got enough time to go and write down what they've just done, because somebody else might want to read it in terms of making sure that she can prove or he can prove that they actually did it. It's an emotionally challenging job. It's a job where you have to deal with people's pain, people's loss of function, death. You have to deal with their relatives. You have to deal sometimes with the guilt that can be there and the grief that can be there. It's a job that requires a really high level of emotional intelligence.
This idea that care work gets broken into a series of physical tasks, undermining the emotional nature of the work, is not new. Back in the 1950s, the renowned psychoanalyst Isabel Menzies-Leith undertook a study of nursing. She found hospitals organised the job of caring so it became task-based and depersonalised. This was to protect nurses from the emotional stress of the work. Jocelyn Cornwell, director of the Point of Care Foundation, runs a programme to improve caring in hospitals. It takes Leith's work as its starting point.
Very young women were being asked to take on very, very difficult work. She describes the work as frightening, distressing. She talked about having to confront death and dying and disfigurement and loss. Her analysis was that all of us have our own natural, normal defences against loss and death and dying, and that what was happening inside the organisation that she was looking at was that the organisation had created its own social processes to defend the people doing the work against these feelings which were difficult to handle. One of them, which I think you can see still today, is the objectification of patients, talking about patients as objects. You can hear a patient spoken about in terms of their bed number or their diagnosis, the stroke in the bay, or in terms of bed blocking. So there's talk of bed blockers when what you're talking about is people. That helps the staff to distance themselves from the individuality of the patients.
Jocelyn believes Leith's findings have relevance for social care today. We have a system that puts low-paid individuals with hardly any training and support into emotionally stressful caring jobs under significant time pressure. In these circumstances, some people may naturally adopt the kind of objectification Leith observed as a coping strategy. In thinking of caring as just another low-paid service sector job, are we complicit in this? John Kennedy thinks that too often, far from seeing this work as being emotionally challenging, there is a public misperception that this is easy work.
There's a fundamental attitude that, well, surely a care home's just about playing Scrabble and having cups of tea with little old ladies. How difficult can that be? And unfortunately, we value it at the absolute lowest level of the labour market. You can earn more working in a supermarket. And I think that's a fundamental hypocrisy of society, because if we really think that care for older people and frail people is really important, why are we letting it, or why are we allowing that to happen with such unsupported, undervalued and low-paid people doing it?
And the reality is that care of older people is becoming more, not less complex. Increasing numbers of older people needing care have dementia and other forms of significant impairment. Graham Stokes is Director of Dementia Care at Bupa, one of the bigger care home operators in the UK.
The fundamental challenge is that you're caring for people who are entering care homes now very distressed, highly dependent, and what that means for people with dementia is to get to that stage of the journey, you are also without any self-awareness and insight, so they actually don't know they're in a safe place receiving good care. To them, they're in a strange place confronted by perplexing behaviours. It's also more complicated by the fact that around 70% of all people with dementia have other morbidities as well. So what happens is the person comes into a care home who is so dependent, you basically only just see the tasks to be done, and as a result, that may damage the relationship with the person. You're actually relating to the task that has to be done. And the numbers of people with dementia are going to double over the next 35 years. You have to train staff to enable them to care for people who do not know they need to be cared for.
So personal care, are you going to write it like this?
No.
Okay, you need to make sure that all your colleagues, they understand what you have written.
This is a training session at Three Sisters Care in Tower Hamlets in East London. Three Sisters provides care to the elderly and people with disabilities in their own homes. It was set up by Jabida Ali and her two sisters as a social enterprise, a business set up specifically to promote social values and reinvest profits back into the business and the local community.
If a client hasn't taken medication, say 1 o'clock, if it is written on the care...
They wanted to use the business to provide work opportunities for women in the local Bangladeshi community. They pride themselves on paying their care workers above market rates and investing in their development.
So whatever we write, whatever we say, we need to think, will others understand this?
There's a strong emphasis on training at Three Sisters. When Jabida first set up the agency, she was shocked at the lack of minimum training standards. The government has only just now introduced very basic ones. But Jabida thinks there are some people who just shouldn't be working in the care profession, no matter how much training they have.
We met people with really very negative attitudes towards disability, people who would touch a client like they were disgusted by them. And you just think, hold on, but you've been a care worker for 15 years.
Why do you think those people work in care if they act as though they find disability disgusting?
It's just a job. For a lot of carers, it's just the job. I've had people say to me in the interview that our first question is, why do you want to be a care worker? And people say things like, I expect in security work, innit? People come with really good references and they're just cruel, you know? So the most important part of that is meeting them, spending 45 minutes with them and then being able to assess, you know what, are you a nice person? Do you have a kind heart? Okay, you don't have this training, but you know what? I can give you that training. If you don't have training, you can give people training, you can gain skills. But if you don't have a kind heart, you're not going to ever give someone a kind heart.
And do you think a kind heart is something you've either got or you haven't?
I don't like saying this, but yeah. I've always wanted to believe that, you know, people are capable of change. But I think if you've come into our office looking for a job and you're in your 30s and you don't have a kind heart, I don't think you're going to change.
I buy Jabida's argument that there are probably some people who have such low levels of the raw ingredients of good caring, like compassion and kindness, that they shouldn't be carers. But given the large and growing number of carers we're going to need as the population ages, and the low pay and status of the sector, just how picky can we afford to be? This is Jocelyn Cornwall from the Point of Care Foundation again.
There is, in any population, a distribution of the ability to be empathetic. Some of us are what's called super empathisers, and some find it very difficult to empathise with others. I think that we have to accept that there is a range and we can't always fish in the most empathetic part of the pond, if you like. I think introducing people to the kinds of things that they would be expected to do, the kinds of things they would be exposed to as caregivers, is very important so that people walk away from the job if they think this isn't for me.
If we accept we're not going to have a care force made up just of saints or super empathisers, what can we do to make sure caring doesn't get boiled down to just a series of tasks? Jocelyn Cornwall thinks we can design more empathy into the system by better supporting people. Her organisation, the Point of Care Foundation, has been introducing Schwartz rounds, an innovation from American hospitals, into hospitals in the UK.
The Schwartz rounds really came out of our interest in looking for interventions that would help to support the staff. It's a 1-hour meeting that takes place usually at lunchtimes. It's open to anybody who wants to come, and that's a very important feature of it. And the meetings begin with a story. 2 or 3 members of staff